welcome, welcome. We can't tell you how happy we are to see so many of you here for this wonderful program. My name is Paula Mays, and I'm the co-chair of the Racial Justice Task Force, which is sponsoring today's event. And on behalf of the Racial Justice Task Force of the Washington National Cathedral, we'd like to welcome you and offer you what we like to call radical hospitality. We are very honored to have a very special guest with us this evening, Dr. David Blight, author of the prize-winning work on America's greatest civil rights champion, one of them, Frederick Douglass. Before we get to Dr. Blight and that treat, here to introduce Dr. Blight, we are also fortunate to have from St. Albans School, right next door, Dr. Sam Schaefer, who's sitting in the front row. Dr. Schaefer is the Associate Dean of Faculty at St. Albans. He is in his 14th year there. Beyond his duties as Associate Dean, Dr. Schaefer also teaches history, coaches basketball, and serves as the Director of the College Counseling. Dr. Schaefer earned his undergraduate degree at University of North Carolina, where he also earned a PhD. He then became a fellow at Yale postgraduate school, where he met Dr. Blight, who served as his mentor for his dissertation, his advisor, and his friend. And we are especially honored because it is because of Dr. Schaefer that we were able to have Dr. Blight with us today, because he's going to be speaking at St. Albans, right next door, tomorrow. And he was kind enough to share them. Today, questioning and talking with Dr. Blight is our own Reverend Canon Dr. Leonard Hamlin, seated here. He is the Canon Missioner of the National Cathedral. Canon Hamlin has been at the Cathedral since 2018. In his position, he oversees the Cathedral's outreach and social justice programs, as well as many other duties. Prior to being at the Cathedral, he was the pastor at Macedonian Baptist Church in Arlington, Virginia for 22 years. The church grew in numbers and service. And if you knew Dr. Hamlin, you would know why. He holds a BA, a PhD, and a master's from Howard Divinity School, so he's a real student of Howard. So now I will turn it over to these gentlemen and let us get started with the evening. And again, welcome.
Thank you very much. There's something very meta about the introducer being introduced. So I won't keep you too long, but I think it is worth introducing Professor David Blight, who I would argue is one of the foremost historians, public intellectuals, and teachers in the country today. And those are the three strands I think that are important. As a historian, I think he is unparalleled. His book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, which he will speak about tonight, as many of you probably know, has won 9 book prizes, including the Bancroft, the Parkman, the Lincoln, and of course the Pulitzer Prize. It's also been optioned to Barack Obama's film company and Netflix, so fingers crossed it will go to production. But Professor Blight's interest in Douglass goes all the way back to his dissertation, which turned into his first book, which is called Frederick Douglass's Civil War, Keeping Faith in Jubilee. Along the way, between that and this, which was, I guess, about 30 years between the two, he's edited books on such topics as from Civil War soldiers to W.E.B. Du Bois, to the Underground Railroad. He wrote a book called American Oracle, which was an intellectual biography of Bruce Catton and Edmund Wilson and James Baldwin and Robert Penn Warren. He wrote a book called A Slave No More, which sort of revived the lives and slave narratives of 2 former slaves. And he probably first came to sort of highest prominence with his book Race and Reunion, which was my favorite book in graduate school, which is a book, a history about memory and memory of the Civil War in American history. And he's really one of the foremost scholars on memory and memory studies in the country. As a public intellectual, we get to benefit from that tonight. He's the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale, which puts on conferences and brings in scholars from all over the country. He's on the boards of many museums. He took part in the 9/11 Museum and Memorial, He's written op-eds, which many of you have probably read, for the New York Times and the LA Times and San Francisco Chronicle and the Boston Globe and on and on. He's taken part in an award-winning textbook, and he's probably given thousands of talks now across the country over his career. He's held fellowships around the world, and he's so generous with his time and thoughts. And I think in a time where, as a historian, I feel like historians' words need to be heard, and he is at the forefront of making sure that his and many others' good work is heard around the country. And then third, he is a teacher. He's taught, through his career, I'm sure, tens of thousands of students. He's been teaching at Yale since 2004, where his course on Civil War Reconstruction routinely has over 300 students. It's one of the most popular courses at Yale. He's taught at Amherst, at Harvard, at North Central College in Illinois, and he began his career teaching 7 years at his high school in Flint, Michigan. So he's taught at every level and every sort of student. His online course on the Civil War at Yale has been viewed by thousands of people. He's taught hundreds of teachers and park rangers at summer seminars on the Underground Railroad and Abolition. And perhaps least importantly for you all, but most importantly for me, he taught me. He was my dissertation advisor and great mentor. My wife worked at the Gilder Lehrman Center for him, and so he has been a great mentor to both of us through our careers. And I think there's no one who has taught me more how to be a historian with grace and humanity and a deep understanding of the human soul. And so it's my great pleasure to invite David Blight to speak tonight.
Oh, Sam, you should have toned that down. Thank you, Sam. Thank you to the Cathedral. Thank you all for coming and packing this room tonight. It is a thrill for me, believe me, to speak in this beautiful space on the 7th floor of this glorious building. I'm coming back in the daylight tomorrow to the 7th floor for the views. I've never been up here. Sam had to like my book, Race and Reunion. He was forced to read it. And in my 16 or more years at Yale, nothing more important has ever happened to me than meeting Sam and Dana. And that's the truth. I mean, you can't replace people. And he had the audacity to come here and get a job and take his wife Dana away from me. She was my associate director of my center, and I thought I was going to have to quit when I lost Dana. But, marriage, family, it matters. I hope only take about 10 minutes here, 15 maximum. I want to get Reverend Hamlin up here, and we're going to have a discussion of this book. I just met Reverend Hamlin tonight, and I know from our dinner together he has really read the book, so I'm a little scared. I've been interviewed about this book many times now, but it's scary because usually the interviewer has just finished it and they know stuff. God, I can't remember what I've written. Frederick Douglass was many things. A lot of you know your Douglass, perhaps some not. He was the prose poet of American democracy in the 19th century, and he holds up pretty well today. In fact, these hundreds of book talks I've been doing for whatever it is now, 15 or 16 months, if it's taught me anything, it is that people seem to need Douglass now, or some Douglasses. With unsurpassed eloquence, he explained the nature of slavery. What was slavery? In its physical ramifications and its mental terms, especially the mental. Douglass may have gone deeper into that than anybody who ever wrote about slavery. What did slavery do to the psyche? What could it potentially do to the psyche? He expressed with a certain terrible honesty and a kind of savage irony both the power of America's creeds and the utter hypocrisy with which his country contradicted and denied them. American hypocrisy was perhaps his favorite subject, until emancipation changed his subjects to a degree. To see and hear Frederick Douglass became a kind of wonder of the American world. I have so many accounts from local newspapers, all kinds of clippings of people describing Douglass, describing the first time they saw him speak, or what he looked like, what he sounded like, what his baritone voice was like. To see Douglass was something people aspired to do. He was a women's rights man in an age when there weren't that many women's rights men. He was for women's rights, not just voting rights, but also women's economic rights. From, well, I won't say day one, but certainly from the 1840s on. He's going to have a terrible breakup and a fight, a very public fight, with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a few other people in 1869 and 70 over the 15th Amendment. That's another story. But he was a women's rights man. He could at times be a thoroughly radical thinker, but at the same time an advocate of a kind of political liberalism, 19th century political liberalism. He had a tremendous faith, sometimes some critics have said too much faith, in the right to vote, in political rights as somehow the solution for all things. At times, he both loved and hated his own country. That doesn't make him unusual. Lots of Americans have had that kind of experience at times. He strongly believed in self-reliance, but also fiercely fought and preached, by the way, self-reliance to his people, to black people, to young black people, before emancipation and especially after emancipation, which the American right today loves to seize upon. You can talk about that if you want to. I'd be happy to. I got another op-ed brewing in me on that subject. But at the same time, he fiercely fought for activist, interventionist government, strong government, to free slaves, defeat the Confederacy, and protect black citizens against terror and discrimination. How could you be a black leader in the 19th century and not believe in both? How could you be a black leader in the 19th century and not believe in self-reliance in a society that would first enslave you, then would at best segregate you, and then might use terror to kill you? You're not going to believe in self-reliance in that world? But you're also going to believe in a government that, by God, despite itself, fought an all-out, horrific, terrible civil war and ended slavery and recrafted its constitution around the great pivotal fact of the 19th century, the emancipation of 4 million slaves. He forged a hard-earned pragmatism out of political experience, of disappointment, despair, and some tremendous victories for his cause. Douglass became a hard-boiled pragmatist in some ways, because he had to if he was going to stay here. He was fundamentally not a self-made man, despite claims by the American right today that that's essentially all he should be remembered for. despite his own claims sometimes that he was a great self-made man. One of his most famous speeches, as I'm sure some of you know, was the speech called The Self-Made Man. He carried it around with him in the 1870s everywhere he went to speak, just in case that's the one they wanted. He always had it in his pocket. We always like to point to Douglass' self-made man speech, but most people never stop. It's like a lot of books. We don't stop to read it. He was the first to admit that there were a lot of people that helped make him, especially women. He seized the King James language of the Bible and used it, especially the Old Testament, to deliver the most enduring critique of slavery, the coming of disunion, the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction, and beyond. Douglass got language in his head from the King James cadences, from the King James Bible as a child, then as an early teenager, then as a late teenager, and then as an adult. More on that in just a moment. There was always in Douglass, and this may be why he resonates today, I can't quite explain it, but there was always in Douglass a moral purpose to his politics. And aren't we yearning for that somehow? Met any moral purposes in politics recently? Well, I didn't say that. He did. I would never inject partisanship into, not for the next minute. Last but not least, Douglass deserves, and Reverend Hamlin and I are going to talk about this, he deserves the label that I stuck on the cover of this book, although it was one of the most difficult aspects of writing this book. He deserves the label or title of prophet. Now, I talk about this in all my book talks, not just because I'm in the National Cathedral. I wish my mom was alive. I'd call her up tonight and say, "You ain't gonna believe where I spoke tonight." You know, you get to speak a lot of places. I've spoken in Ford's Theater, and I've spoken in all kinds of fancy places, but I've never spoken here. Prophet. What is a prophet? When I had to organize this book, I did what all biographers do. If we're honest about it, you're trying to shape a life. I mean, if somebody writes your biography, they're going to work with what you've left them. And it may be a lot, maybe not that much, never quite enough, but you're going to make a shape out of a life. You have to. And this was a long, epic life. He's born in 1818. Out on the eastern shore of Maryland, along a little horseshoe bend in the Tuckahoe River. He's a nobody from nowhere. He's a slave from the eastern shore. If he hadn't lived 9 of his 20 years as a slave in Baltimore, we wouldn't know about him. Baltimore had everything to do with how he ever got out and how he gained some view of the world, and literacy, and religion, and faith, and language. He even joined a debating society in Baltimore, for God's sake. But he's going to live all the way to 1895. He's born in before the first era of American modernity, if we can use that elusive label. He's born before steamboats are out on the rivers. He's born well before the railroad, well before the telegraph, well before the rotary press made possible not just weekly but daily newspapers, and a million other patents out of the U.S. Patent Office that revolutionized all kinds of machinery and technology. But he's going to live all the way to another era of modernity, when steamships can cross the Atlantic in 8 days. He was enthralled with steamship travel, by the way, as most people were who did it. His first voyage across the Atlantic took about 18 days. second one, the last one, 8 days. Wow. None of us would tolerate 8 hours. We can't bear a flight, it's like flying to Asia, oh my God. But he's going to live to the age of these electric light bulbs and the first telephones. To Edison's lab in New Jersey, pumping out all these things that Edison and his team kept inventing. And he's going to live all the way to the age of the phonograph. But so far as we know, he was never recorded. I don't think he ever was recorded. I have good reason to believe that because about 3 months before he died, he went over to a friend's house here in Washington, a man named Anderson, and he had dinner, and he went back home and did what almost nobody does anymore. He wrote a thank you letter for dinner. But most of the letter was all about that night he had heard a phonograph for the first time. And Mr. Anderson had played a recording of a good friend of Douglas's, a black minister named Weirs. And Douglas heard his good friend's voice recorded, and he went on for paragraphs about this magical, he called it the divine invention. And he ends the letter by saying something like, "Is it possible the human voice could live forever?" I mean, he was talking about himself there. But he doesn't write that letter if he'd been recorded. On the other hand, if any of you are collectors, and if you encounter a recording of Douglas, will you call me first? I'll make you an offer. We can make a deal. Please, don't call up your local historical society. Call me. Anyway, but in the middle of that long, epic life, look what he lives through. Not only slavery, the abolition movement. He becomes, in many ways, the greatest of American abolitionists. He might have a rival or two for that, at least they thought they were. He's going to live through the great political crisis, at least of the Civil War. The war itself, of course. The Armageddon is going to destroy slavery and force the reinvention, reimagining of a second American Republic. He lives through emancipation. He lives all through Reconstruction. He lives through the rise and excitement and incredible optimism of the beginning of Reconstruction. And then its failure and its betrayal and its demise almost as fast as it rose. He's going to live into the earliest years of the Jim Crow system and segregation. And he's going to live all the way to the early era of lynching in the 1890s. But no one in the 19th century in the United States had more to say about all of that than Douglas, with an eloquence unmatched. He wrote millions of words. He wrote 1,200 pages of autobiography. If you're a biographer, never trust anybody who wrote 3 autobiographies. Because they're trying to control what you do with them. Of course he was. And his autobiographies are always there in your way. Trying to see under him and around him and from the side and through him. And there's a great deal he doesn't tell us in those autobiographies, like almost everything about his private life. And his 2 marriages and relationships and his 4 adult children and how complicated his extended family became. He's not going to tell us that. He wrote thousands of speeches, some of the greatest works of oratory in all of American history. Not just the famous 4th of July speech, but dozens of others. I have my own top 10 ranking, if anybody wants to talk about that. But we can fight about that. And he wrote hundreds and hundreds of the short-form political editorials in the 16 years of his newspaper. He mastered that form, too, the more declarative, short-form political editorial. He wrote 1 novella in 1852. Would that he tried fiction more often. Although there have been many critics who have said those autobiographies have a good deal of fiction. And all great autobiographies do. Any of you have written autobiographies? Come on. Who are you? you trying to control? What part of your past are you trying to retrieve or put away, make stable? What loss in life are you trying to manage? That's what autobiography is. Anyway, I had to organize this life. I organized it around words because we wouldn't be here if it weren't for Douglass's words. I organized it around the autobiographies because they're both source and subject. I organized it around this idea of the old radical outsider who becomes the political insider. This is an old radical reformer who lives to see his cause win in his 40s, in the middle of life. That's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to be the beleaguered reformer forever if your cause is that. Who had the audacity to think you were going to end slavery in 1855? Come on. Or take 57 after the Dred Scott case? But he's going to live to reap this victory and then get his toeholds inside the Republican Party and then a whole foothold inside the federal government with 3 appointments in the federal bureaucracy, including U.S. Minister to Haiti in 1889. What happens to an old radical when they get inside power a little bit? What kinds of deals and compromises do they tend to make? That's fascinating. And then I organized the book as well around this issue that all biographers face, especially modern biography, and that is, how do you find the balance between the public and the private life? And I had a vow with myself in this book, and those of you who've already read it, you can judge me. I welcome it. I had a vow, and that was that there was not going to be any single chapter that was just about the public life or just about the private life. The two always had to be woven together to some degree, because that's the way we live life. How many days do you get to wake up and say, I'm only going to be private today? Well, I don't know, maybe if you're retired and you just get to spend a day reading. God, that sounds good. Or I'm just going to be public today. And you are mostly public, but then you get the call, oh God, your grandson had an accident, your whatever, somebody got sick, or, name it. Douglass woke up every day of his life in the 1870s and 1880s wondering what has gone wrong today with one of his sons and his daughter and his 21 grandchildren and his 3 fictive siblings and a variety of other hangers-on who were always around Douglass because they thought he had money. What are they writing today about me in the newspaper? Oh, my son had a bankruptcy. Oh, my son-in-law is suing me. And he did. And then, finally, there's the theme of Douglass, the thinker, the artist, the intellectual. And he was one heck of an intellectual. Yes, he had not a single day of formal education in his life. Yes, that was possible in the 19th century. He was always sensitive about that. This was a hypersensitive man. He was especially hypersensitive about racial slights and slights about his lack of education. You wanted to get up his gander, accuse him of not knowing enough about something. Or Jim Crow him in a hotel. On a train, you got Jim Crow more times than you could count. But last but not least, there's 6 big themes that this book is built around. But the 6th one is this question of the Bible. His use of the Bible. I'm less concerned in this book, and this is our lead-in, Reverend Hamlin, I hope. I'm less concerned in this book about Douglass's actual faith. I mean, I talk about that to the extent we can know it. It's not as discernible. It changes over time as it does for most humans. But I'm very concerned in this book about the ways in which he used biblical storytelling, biblical metaphor, and especially the Hebrew prophets. And along the way in writing this book, I was terrified by several issues and never felt like I was really resolving them. One of the biggest was Douglass and women, the marriages, the relationships, his daughter, etc. But the other one was what to do about this Bible. I wanted to use that word prophet. But prophet's a huge word. You shouldn't throw it around like popcorn. This is prophetic and that's prophetic. Oh, she's prophetic. Oh, that sounded prophetic. And I have no formal theological training. Confession. I've always been interested in religion. I think I took 2 religion courses as an undergraduate. It was Introduction to the New Testament and Introduction to something else. I once taught a course called Comparative World Religions at the high school level in a public high school for 3 or 4 years. No one else wanted to teach it, and I thought, okay. I'll read something on Buddhism the night before I teach it, and I'll read something on Confucianism the night before I teach it, and it was cool, it was fun. The kids didn't seem to know, I didn't know what I was talking about. Some parents got upset. Why would a public school teach a course? Well, because religion is an important force in history. Anyway, I didn't have any formal training, but I have several friends who are theologians. Seriously, and they helped me. I called them up. I'll name one anyway. Don Schreiber. I don't know if any of you know Donald. He's in his 90s now. He used to be president of Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He is North Carolina and Virginia born and raised. He grew up in a white Southerner who grew up in segregation. His life was transformed by the Civil Rights Movement. He became a social gospel, passionate scholar, activist, etc. And I got to know Don over the years by various means, and I called him up finally. And I said, Don, I'm struggling. I got to figure out what to do with all of Douglass's uses of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Ezekiel. What do I do with this? He says, come on down to New York, let's have lunch. We went to a little restaurant on Broadway up by Columbia. And when Don got finished laughing at me when I said, Don, what should I read on the Old Testament? He said, all right, sit down. You got to read Robert Alton. You got to read Walter Brueggemann. You got to read so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so. Especially Brueggemann, he said. Well, I found out Brueggemann's only written 40 or 50 books. But the prophetic imagination. And then Brueggemann's guide, he has these guidebooks he did about Exodus and guidebooks about Isaiah. Brueggemann began to save me. And then I asked my good friend, a rabbi at Yale University, Jim Pullman. He used to be head rabbi at Yale until he retired and started attending my lecture class with his wife Alana. They always sat in the front row. And he discovered through our conversations my dilemma with this word prophet. And it was another one of those lunches where he said, David, sit down. You got to read this, you got to read that, you got to read this, you got to read that, but you got to read Abraham Heschel. Especially the book called The Prophets, but then this book and that book and that book. And I read Heschel, a lot of Heschel. I'll just quote Heschel once. Although I think I quote him 4 times in the book. The prophet is human, wrote Heschel. Yet he employs notes 1 octave too high for our ears. He experiences moments that defy our understanding. He is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of our mind. Often his words begin to burn where our conscience ends. An assaulter of our mind. Another place Heschel says, the true prophet, he's talking about the Hebrew prophet, he's talking about the Old Testament prophet. So the prophets had to have been shattered by something in their lives because their job was to shatter other people. in that tradition that Heschel, Brueggemann, and others wrote, prophets aren't nice. They're not fun to have lunch with. They're there to trouble us, to demand more of us, to show us what we're denying, to show us what we're blind about. And they are creatures of words. Words, words, words. They hear words the rest of us can't quite find. They have ways of explaining events in history, cataclysms, triumphs, conditions that we can't quite find the words for. But once in a while, someone comes along and they find those words. That's Douglass. And the more and more I read Heschel and Brueggemann and others, I kept having those moments where I say, yeah, okay, that's Douglass. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's Douglass. So I got away with it. Prophets on the cover of this book, and I'm still waiting. You shouldn't say it here. Right. I'm still waiting for a theologian to review this book and take me to pieces. But it hasn't happened yet. I don't know what's up. So far I've gotten away with it. Thank you. Let's get Reverend.
Let me say, I believe this is, yeah, they're wrong. I want to say that is, Dr. Blight has stated that he's thrilled, of course, to be here at the Cathedral. We're thrilled to have him here. We take a good look around the room, and I think that you can see tonight just how thrilled many of us are to have you here on this occasion. But I will begin as something I told him privately that I say here publicly. He's given me a sense of accomplishment and allowed me to claim some achievement that I have gotten through every word.
Well, and it ruined countless weekends.
But the good part about this is that while I can say getting through every word, there are many in here who would probably agree with me just what an enjoyable journey it was to be able to get through this. Before we get to the prophet.
Shouldn't do that if you haven't read it yet.
Before we get to the prophet.
Yeah.
For me, really with the biographer,
Yeah.
when they're writing, there's always some of them as well. That's part of the process. And that's part of this. And so you've been writing about Douglass really a long time. And where I'd like to begin is to really ask you personally, why Douglass? And what do you want us to see in spending so much time in his life?
Well, why Douglass? I never learned anything about Douglass in high school. That I'm sure of. It says something about how old I am. I encountered Douglass in college, but only a little. I took the first ever Black History course taught at Michigan State in either 1968 or 69. I can't remember which year. It was taught by Les Rout. Les was an African American, but his field was Brazil. I mean, Les wrote books about Juan Perón, in modern Brazil. But I suspect what happened was, it was the late 60s, and they said, Les, you're Black, teach the course. And he did, and it was great. We read a little piece of, we read something of Douglass then, I can't recall what. But it was as a high school teacher. In the 1970s, we were creating courses in Black history. We didn't know what we were doing, to speak of. I remember I got Flint was a prosperous town, it was Flint, Michigan. Had a great school system. And I got our school librarian to buy, I don't know, it was like 100 copies of John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. 6th edition, or 7th, whatever it was. Yes, to John Hope. Anyway, and I had a poster of Douglass you know, the Scholastic Company or whoever makes all that stuff for teachers. Yeah, I still have that poster framed up in my apartment. And one of the reasons I love it, not just because it's such a keepsake from, 100 years ago, but it has the wrong birth date for Douglas. And it gives him a middle initial of E. No middle initial. I don't know where they got that from. It's like having a great like a Mickey Mantle baseball card with some wrong statistics on it or something. It would make it so valuable, you know what I mean? Anyway, but it was in graduate school that I went to PhD program at Wisconsin. I wanted to work on abolitionists. I wanted to work on black abolitionists. I landed on Douglas because in part he left us the most to work with. Now I'm going to fast forward though to give you a sense of why I wrote this book, and I'll do it quickly. I had Douglas out of my life. I did a first book on Douglas. I edited editions of his first 2 autobiographies. I edited an edition of the Columbian Orator, that book he discovers when he's 12 and 13 years old. Put that out in 1997 on its 200th anniversary. I wrote essays on Douglas. Douglas is some part, at least, of every other book I've ever written. I mean, he's there, I quote him, he's in the index. But Douglas was gone, finally. Until about 12 and a half years ago, I went to Savannah, Georgia, to give another talk to middle and high school teachers about Douglas's narrative, because they were teaching it. I've done this many, many times. I love doing this. And my host was the Georgia Historical Society, and its chief historian said, there's a local gentleman here in Savannah who's a collector, and he'd like to meet you and have lunch. And apparently I said something like, I guess so, which was not terribly appropriate. And long story short, that day I met Walter Evans, a most extraordinary man. Walter is, if you've read the opening of the book, you know this. Walter is an African-American retired surgeon who grew up in segregated Savannah, went north for his higher education, BA at Howard. Yeah, Howard. Went to medical school at the University of Michigan, and then practiced for nearly 35 years as a general surgeon and made a very good living at it in Detroit, which gave us a lot in common too. Although Walter had season tickets to Tigers games. We never could afford that. Anyway, but Walter's real passion in life was collecting African-American rare books, manuscripts, and art. In fact, his art collection is far more famous and important than his manuscripts and rare books. But he owns one of those 4-story brownstones in Savannah. If you know Savannah, it's on Jones Street, just 2 blocks off Forsyth Park. The house is absolutely chocked full, every room, with manuscript boxes and rare books and art. Fantastic art. He's actually the executor of Jacob Lawrence's estate. But anyway, that day he took me over to his house, got out on his dining room table, a portion of his Frederick Douglass collection, and it was not, I must say, some sort of road to Damascus moment. It was not, oh, my destiny just struck me and I'm going to write this new biography of Douglass. No way. It took me months to get up the courage, or whatever that was, because this was daunting. But that collection is particularly a huge window, new window, into the last third of Douglass's life, the post-war life, the last 30 years of Douglass's life. And the core of the collection are 9 very large Douglass family scrapbooks that were kept by his sons over the last 30, 35 years of their father's life. It includes thousands and thousands of newspaper clippings that you could never otherwise access, and a lot of family documents, precious family documents. That collection made possible illuminating that last third of Douglass's life, the aging Douglass, the older Douglass, and it turns out aging people are not just falling out of touch and becoming less interesting. Here's to aging. Even if you're in your 20s, it's destiny. But this aging patriarch, it turns out, was fascinating. He had all kinds of rivalries with the next generation. Surprise? Of young black leaders who wanted to knock him off, etc. That's why this book happened. And if you note inside the cover, this book is dedicated to Linda and Walter Evans. I spent at least 6 Yale spring breaks in Savannah, which is tough duty, because that's mid-March during azalea time. That's when you're really tough. You sit in an archive all day. But I've never been in a better archive than the Evans' dining room table. I went there many other weeks at various times, and Walter and Linda are now dear friends. They're sort of my patrons. And we're about 95% sure now that that collection is finally going to get moved to the Beinecke Library at Yale. But Walter is a heck of a businessman. And he waited for the book to come out. Anyway, he's a clever guy. But over time, I had put Douglass away, but he came and got me.
And we're glad he did, that he got you, because we know that Douglass, of course, is so relevant to now. And for anyone, of course, who would be reading the book, or you look at that at the very beginning as well, you make it clear how words have power, and there's the power of words. And so we would not be the National Cathedral unless we jumped into, of course, your title, the prophet, in this. And certainly, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, that in recent years, being involved in so many different discussions with other theologians and pastors out of the African American tradition, this whole discussion of being prophetic and the prophet has taken on new life within the past 10 years. And so when I saw the cover, immediately it intrigued me. And your whole, as you began to talk about why you used the title, could you talk a little bit about the influences of Douglass, you know, his, perhaps the pastoring and who he was met in Baltimore, how that affected and shaped his life, as well as these words that are still reverberating through many of us today?
Well, I love the way you asked that question, Reverend, because he comes by this as a child. His mistress in Baltimore, Sophia Hall, teaches him his alphabet for about 1.5 years when he's only 7 and 8 years old, and she reads the Bible out loud. Now, does he understand the Bible at that point? No, but that's the language he's hearing. Then as a kid, he's like 10 and 11, he starts hanging out in the streets of Baltimore with a bunch of white kids who are mostly immigrant kids. They're German, they're Irish, and they're only 10 and 11-year-old boys. They haven't learned their racism yet. They think little Fred's a cool guy. And they all hang out. They all got a school book. You know, they all got the school book called the Columbian Orator. And they get to go to school, they get to read. And Douglass claims he had these rather philosophical conversations with them, and he had convinced them that he should never be a slave. And maybe, why not? But pretty soon, he also meets an old black preacher, a man named Charles Lawson. Preacher in the sense that he was basically a kind of a man about town, a gadfly. Some people might have today even call him a kind of a storefront preacher. Lawson drove a cart by day. He was a drayman to make a few dollars or pennies. But he was really a Bible fanatic. And when he found that this kid, Fred Bailey, could read so well at age 12, every chance they got, according to Douglass, Sundays, days off, nighttime, he'd sit this kid down and they would read the Bible out loud for hours and hours and hours, and Douglass says especially the Old Testament. Now, what's a 12 and 13-year-old going to understand out of these Old Testament stories? How much do you understand of Old Testament stories sometimes? But that's where he got language in his head, reading out loud with old Lawson. He called him Father Lawson or Uncle Lawson at times. Then he tells us he attended no less than 4 different churches in Baltimore. 2 pastored by white preachers, 2 pastored by black preachers. One was an AME church, the Bethel AME on Dallas Street in Fells Point. The other one might have been Baptist, your tradition. I think it was Baptist. And he even tells us, especially in the second autobiography, what he thought of each of the four preachers. You know, we're always commenting on our preachers, aren't we? They do this well, and they don't do that well, or whatever. He gets exposed to preaching. Now, he doesn't come out of slavery, you know, talented at homiletics yet, but he also tells us that when he's assigned or rented out to William Freeland's farm when he's 17 and 18 years old, on Sundays he took his what he called band of brothers out into a little woods or a brush arbor because they'd get Sunday off or an afternoon off, and he would preach with them. He would teach them how to preach from the Columbian order. He would teach them techniques of oratory. And they'd read parts of the Bible out because he was the only one among them who was literate. And what does every kid want? And by the way, he was the youngest. But what does every kid want to figure out and know? It's what you're good at. I mean, every kid does, whatever that might be. And some kids find it early, some kids don't find it. But he found out he could get up and use words. And it was a form of power. He's already doing that as a teenager in slavery. And then when he escapes, of course, and I'll leave it there, he and Anna, his first wife, of 44 years, end up in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And the first thing he does in New Bedford, well, maybe the second or third thing he does, is he goes down to the little AME church, AME Zion, becomes a member. Within the first year he's there at age 21, they had him in the pulpit. It's not, I don't know how they just got, I mean, they probably just found out this kid can preach, or this kid can talk. And that's where he learned a kind of formal homiletics, preaching to the text. And that's where he gets discovered by Garrisonian abolitionists from Boston in 1840 and 41, and invited out to Nantucket to a big anti-slavery convention where he gives actually his second time that he ever spoke to an audience of white people. But this, and by the way, I wanted to say there that you shouldn't think of Douglass as simply a product of the sermonic tradition in the sense that he could just get up and blow out the lights in a hall off the top of his head. He could do that too if you wanted him to. But every major Douglass speech, and there are dozens and dozens that I would call major speeches, exist in a text form, at least from 1845 on. He wrote them down. Some of them 25 pages long. He had a text. Now, it doesn't mean he didn't stray from the text. You would never do that. But it's the sermonic language that is in his head, and it's the cadences of the King James that puts the music of language in his head very, very early. So, exactly what he believed, he says something about, but not enough.
Well, because I wanted to, and I think you're digging into something, let me confess, I'm straying from my text now. Because you
Go for it, Reverend.
You have don't encourage a Baptist preacher. As
For a moment, I thought you were Episcopalian. I'm sorry.
I better leave that one alone.
My fault.
As you were digging into that and the influences, I think when it comes to looking at Douglass's life, both public and private, the influences, as you said, the power of words, and him looking at the prophets in their tradition, he was more than words, and what he had to struggle with before we get into some of these private areas, he was more than words, where he was not a complete pacifist.
No, he had a hard time with that one.
And he had a hard time with that. And I think as we talk about faith in these days, when we talk about the influences, can you talk a little bit about how he struggled with that line of perhaps what we would call active engagement, and even perhaps a little bit about his relationship with John Brown?
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, I need to do that one quickly. he comes under the influence, of course, of William Lloyd Garrison, the great Massachusetts abolitionist who, in a real sense, discovered him. Gave him his first paid work with his voice. He wasn't paid much, but paid work. Sent him out on the lecture circuit in 1841, 42, 43, 44, where Douglass gave hundreds and hundreds of speeches. But he was deeply influenced by Garrison. Garrison was the real thing, a real radical abolitionist. But Garrison, and a deeply religious abolitionist, though he did not have any ministerial training. But Garrison was a kind of anarchist. Garrison had 6 or 7 strategic tenets that you had to follow, or you're thrown out of the fold. And one of them was pacifism, or what the 19th century called non-resistance. Another was anti-politics. You were not to get involved in the dirtiness of politics, particularly political parties. And a third, terribly important, was Garrison's idea, wasn't just Garrison's, but that the Constitution itself, the U.S. Constitution, was so deeply complicitous with slavery that you should not participate in anything within the American political system. It was sometimes called come-outerism. Come out of institutions, come out of the Constitution. But Garrison also believed in black civil rights. He believed in women's rights. It was a difficult mixed bag of principles and tenets and strategies to follow. Douglass eventually really falls out with Garrison by his late 20s, and certainly by the time he turns 30, in early 30s, especially the anti-politics, the pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution, and the question of violence. Now, Douglass was never one to go out and organize a slave insurrection, for good reason. Organizers of slave insurrections don't live. There were none of them who lived to tell it. And former slaves knew that. But he meets John Brown in 1847 or 48, doesn't matter which year, but that's still complicated. And by my count, I have a whole chapter on the relationship with John Brown. They met at least 11 times over the course of a decade. He was intrigued to no end with this guy, John Brown, who was in some ways the consummate radical, although his radicalism took forms that most black abolitionists found it difficult, if not impossible, to follow. He believed in a Mosaic kind of justice. He never belonged to any political party, and he may have never voted, in John Brown's case. But Douglass was always listening to Brown, as long as Brown was talking about what Brown at one point called, and this was the problem with John Brown, his plans were always so mysterious. If you're going to join something that's going to get you killed, you at least ought to know where it's going. Where is it that I'm going to die? But Brown used to talk about what he called the subterranean passageway. Doesn't that sound intriguing? It was kind of an overground railroad. It was going to be a series of forts, manned by warriors and men, funneling slaves out of the South into the North. A paramilitary, or maybe a military, kind of overground railroad. And a measure of the desperation that many abolitionists felt through the course of the 1850s, as this political crisis over slavery in westward expansion and in the government continues to collapse into eventually, especially after the Dred Scott decision in 1857, a real despair that maybe there is no future in America for black people. And the more and more desperate some abolitionists became, the more and more they tended to listen to a John Brown. But what separated them in the end was when Douglass found out that it was going to be Harper's Ferry, the largest federal arsenal in the United States. But Douglass was still warm enough toward John Brown that he agreed, when John Brown's oldest son went to Douglass's house in Rochester and said, "Would you please come meet Father down in Pennsylvania?" It was August of 1859, only 2.5 months before the raid. And Douglass famously meets John Brown for apparently 2 nights. They camped out in an old stone quarry near Chambersburg, and they had it out. Brown trying to convince Douglass to join him. Douglass trying to convince John Brown, don't do this. It's suicidal, you're gonna get caught. He used the metaphor, he said, that the bees will swarm. You'll all be destroyed. They parted ways. Douglass did bring along, I think it was $400, which had been given to him by other abolitionists to give to John Brown. And in every conceivable legal sense, Douglass was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Harper's Ferry raid. But Douglass went home 2.5 months later, October 19, 18, whatever it was. Douglass was in Philadelphia giving a speech, or about to give a speech, and then all the news came over the wires. There's been this raid on Harper's Ferry by this bearded old man and however many men. And I was like, oh God. Douglass just barely got out by the skin of his teeth, back up to Rochester, and off to Canada, off to Niagara Falls actually for about 3 weeks. About 24 hours ahead of U.S. Marshals who would have arrested him. And had they caught him then, he would have been tried, not that there's any question, and probably hanged, along with John Brown, or in the wake of John Brown's hanging, when some others of his men were hanged. He will flee to England for about 7 months, not knowing if he could ever come back. But he came back, of course, in the spring of 1860 because his daughter Annie, 11 years old, his wife's namesake, died of diphtheria. And he snuck back in through Canada, not knowing if he could be safe. He was safe because by then, the commission that was investigating the Harper's Ferry raid had decided no more prosecutions, no more hangings, no more martyrs, no more investigation. And Douglass was lucky, although he laid low throughout that summer of 1860, not knowing if he could, where he could go just yet. But anyway, he, early in the 1850s, came to the realization that he could never completely get comfortable with that slavery was going to probably have to end by violence. The question was how, by what means, under what kind of justification. He many times in editorials said things like, why does a slave catcher fear having his throat cut? It is because he deserves to have his throat cut. And then some. How do you make the fugitive slave law a dead letter? He said. You make a few dead slave catchers. Now that's rhetoric. That's not action yet. But once the war came, Douglass transformed into one of the most virulent, rhetorically violent war propagandists the United States has ever produced. But that's another story, and that's beyond John Brown, so sorry, I got a little ahead there.
It all ties in there together because his wrestle with that, I think for many of us.
It's a torture problem.
It's a hard line to walk and to figure out where you draw those lines and to live with that. Douglass, we're encouraged by his endurance, of course, of being able to deal with so many things, and the relationships that really affected his life. You touched on one with Garrison, and while he had this imagination, and that's why the prophet and the prophetic imagination to me was so intriguing, and it always been reading those, because he always envisioned something different. That relationship he had with Garrison, before he went overseas, and he spent all those years, of course, with Garrison, there seemed to have been perhaps never a conversation about his freedom. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you would touch on, because
His legal freedom.
his legal freedom.
Yeah.
And he received his legal freedom
From his
overseas,
Right.
which benefactors overseas,
from his British friends.
right, which perhaps created some tension in that relationship. Is
Yeah.
that possible, or what might be your thoughts? And talk about that.
Oh, that's great. Let's do the Douglass Garrison relationship the rest of the night. It was a terribly important relationship. It was a kind of mentor-student relationship, a little bit older brother, younger brother, maybe even father-son. Garrison was 12 years older and had a very prophetic aura about him. Douglass learned a great deal from Garrison in both substance and style. But he broke with Garrison on these strategies, on these principles, and he broke with him personally. And that breakup, which occurs over about a 3-year period between 1849 and 1852, is the first great personal crisis of Douglass's. I mean, the crisis of escaping from slavery is a pretty big crisis. That might be the first. But it's the first great personal crisis in Douglass's life, where he has a world he has built that just collapses. And the Garrisonians attacked Douglass attacked Douglass as much as they attacked slavery, because Douglass became an apostate to them. And that included black Garrisonians and white Garrisonians. Garrison prompted tremendous loyalty. And Douglass went on his own now. He created his own newspaper out in Rochester. His bacon is saved for him, namely by 2 people, Gerrit Smith, the wealthy upstate New York abolitionist, who underwrote Douglass's newspaper at times and kept it afloat, and then an English woman named Julia Griffiths, one of the many English friends he made, who came over to the U.S., lived in Rochester for 6 years, 3 of them in the Douglass home, became his assistant editor, his chief fundraiser, his personal confidant. Some claimed more than that, namely the Garrisonians claimed that, although we don't know. And personally, I don't think that was a sexual relationship. I can't prove it. He had another relationship of 22 years that probably was. We could get to that later if you want, or not. But he breaks with Garrison in the early 1850s, and it's a terrible breakup. And one of the reasons they broke up is because the Garrisonians accused Douglass of having an affair with Julia Griffiths in his own house. They never made up. They never really made up. They never appeared together again until the first year of the Civil War on the same platform. Even on Emancipation Night, January 1, 1863, in Boston, they appeared at separate celebrations. And even when Garrison died, 1879, Douglass didn't attend the memorial, although he wrote an extraordinary eulogy of Garrison that is blunt, honest, and very honorable. It would not be the last time Douglass would have a close, dear friendship that would break up. He made friends much easier with women abolitionists, than he sometimes did with men. Maybe in part because women weren't threatening. Men were. But it is, as you said, a group of British abolitionists during his 18 months in Britain, or Ireland, Scotland, and Britain, in 1845 to 47, they organized a campaign to raise the money to buy his freedom. And that was thoroughly, officially, and legally negotiated by the Richardson sisters of Newcastle on Tyne with Thomas Auld, Douglass's owner. He was sold for $760. Well, the transaction was in British pounds, but that's what it comes out to in the U.S. His body and his life was worth $766 in 1847. And he did not return to America until Thomas Auld sent him his free papers. I wrote an op-ed once, some of you may or may not remember it, in the New York Times, suggesting that the modern Republican Party should create the Frederick Douglass voucher system and just give every black American $766 and just to not vote. Instead of suppressing their votes and going through all the machinations they go through to try to keep black people from voting, just pay them and call it the Douglass voucher. and see if anybody takes it. But didn't get anywhere with that. I'm glad. That's what he was worth in dollars in 1847. And that meant he spent 9 years as a fugitive slave, susceptible to capture. So
I often wondered about that because all those years, or could he had perhaps harbored some even animosity or wanted to get away from, because now he has these conversations about freedom that he was not having with someone who was trying to control him all those years.
yeah, and the control was part of the issue with Garrison.
Yes,
no question.
and of course there was a monetary, of course, benefit for Garrison and the organization to have him in that position.
Douglass was their star,
Yes,
and the star left the fold.
yes.
He became a free agent. He had a hard time making a living as a free agent. You know, the Lakers didn't sign him. Between 1841 and 1877, his whole middle of his life, he never made a dime any other way than with his voice and his pen. Except for he had a few British benefactors who raised money for his newspaper and for his family. And he had Garrett Smith in New York State, who sometimes would send checks. He had a few patrons, but he went on his own. And it was terrifying. And he had actually the first of what I think were two near complete emotional breakdowns in about 1852. During this breakup with Garrison, he becomes very ill. He's bedridden. There are times he cannot work on the newspaper. He even announces in the newspaper, "I will not be able to write this week or this month. I am bedridden. I have a paralysis in my limbs, and Miss Griffiths will be editing the paper." I can go on. It's in the book.
Even as we prepare, because we're going to leave some room for questions, I know as we start to prepare for the questions, I do want to ask and allow time for you all to raise some questions, of course, with Dr. Blight. But let me ask this while we're getting set, because I know they're going to move through this. But when we look at his life, because it must have been frustrating for him to see freedom or to imagine freedom, I said not experience it, but he also had, as we say, this private life. And while it's operating in the background, his first wife, Anna, who just seems to be operating in the background. And then there are other relationships. Can you talk a little bit about his private and the tensions and all that were there?
Woo. Yeah. Anna, his wife of 44 years, Anna Murray Douglass, he meets in Baltimore when he's a teenager, probably when he's 18, either 18 or 19. Anna was born free out on the eastern shore, about 3 miles from where Douglass was born. She's about 3 years older. They may have even played at the same mill on the Tuckahoe when they were children, because that's where all the kids went to play. But they meet in Baltimore. She had a good job. I mean, as good a job as a struggling young black woman in her early 20s could manage. She worked as a domestic in a white family's house. But when she met Douglass, clearly she decided she was going to hitch her wagon to this guy, for better or worse. And when he escaped from slavery in August of 1838, she waited for the news. He wrote to a friend. We don't know who he wrote to, because Anna remained illiterate all of her life. She did not read. He somehow got a letter back to Baltimore from New York City and said, "I'm here, come on." She took the same 3 trains and 3 boats, and about 38 hours from Baltimore to New York City, and joined him in Lower Manhattan, where they were married. And she brought with her a purple dress that she had made. She was married in a purple dress. Found that out from a little narrative her daughter wrote about her. Anna would remain the core of their home, the mother of their 5 children, the post of my home, he called her when she died. She's a very enigmatic woman. The single most difficult thing to figure out and explain, well, it's in the top two anyway, in this book was Anna. Getting to know Anna is almost impossible, but not quite impossible. We have now, because of the Evans collection, I didn't have time to tell you, among the things in that Evans collection are two handwritten narratives by two of the sons, one by Charles, one by Fred Jr. One is called Growing Up in the Douglass Home. The other is called My Parents, as I Knew Them. You kill for that kind of document if you're the biographer. Yes, tell me about your parents. Tell me more, not just 15 pages. I want 150 pages. But I learned a lot in those little narratives. They're handwritten, and they're just put into the scrapbooks. They don't exist anywhere else. There's also a wonderful reminiscence by Rosetta, their daughter, the oldest child, that she wrote in about 1902, well after both of her parents had died. It's called My Mother as I Recall Her. We can also get at Anna from letters people wrote about her. She's not easy to get to. I'll stay with that just for a second. But there are ways you can imagine a context for this woman, this incredibly brave, sturdy, stern woman, because those children's narratives about her tell us many things, not least of which was that she was a temperance woman. No booze in her house. Now, Douglass spent half of his life out on the road. That doesn't mean he was totally temperance. I would doubt that he was. But no booze in Anna's house. She was famous for her Maryland biscuits. She ran her kitchen. And she built a huge garden in Rochester with orchards. And didn't have a lot of help with it. And she raised those children with a father who was for months at a time absent. And I was told by a couple women historian friends of mine to stop being so hard on Douglass for being the absent father. They kept reminding me, it's the 19th century, idiot. That's how he made a living. He had to leave. Oh, okay, all right. But when Anna died in 1882, after several strokes and a lot of bad health for years, Douglass came apart. He had what might have been the second emotional collapse of his life. There could have even been another one. Those are hard to get at, too. But when she died, and they held her funeral, which was a huge public affair here in D.C., and all the younger black leaders around D.C. were elbowing each other out of the way to become pallbearers for Douglass's wife's funeral, and then the next day went back to hammering Douglass in the press. But when Anna dies, Douglass went to pieces. He wandered up to Maine. He went to Poland Springs, Maine. You know where the water bottles come from? It's probably water from the Boston taps. Poland Springs had a resort. And there's some evidence he may have stayed at a farmhouse up there. I can't be sure. Or he may have stayed at the resort. I don't know. But he spent like 2 months up there by himself. But he wrote a bunch of letters to Rosetta, his daughter. And they're priceless, about his inner life, to some degree, about as much as he ever is going to tell us. And he boarded up Anna's bedroom in the house for a while. And then, about 14 months later, he married Helen Pitts, to the great surprise, well, of the entire world, but especially of his children, who didn't know it was going to happen. They got married in private one afternoon in the parlor of Francis Grimke's house. Francis Grimke was a young black minister. They decided to take the flag after rather than before. But here was the problem. He'd hired Helen Pitts, this fascinating younger woman. She was 20 years younger. She was 46, he was 66. He hired her as one of the clerks in the Recorder of Deeds office, where Douglass got 8 appointments as his clerks. First 4, were his 4 adult children. Which, by the way, he got savaged for in the Washington, D.C. press for nepotism. And finally, one day, he talked to the press and he said, yeah, okay, it is. My kids need jobs, thank you. Now, you couldn't get away with that today. They're still awake. But here was the problem. Helen sat right next to Rosetta. Their desks were right next to each other as clerks in the Recorder of Deeds office, and they were almost exactly the same age. A reporter walks into Rosetta that afternoon and says, you aware that your father just bought a marriage license down the hall here? Because it was in City Hall, here in D.C. And Rosetta's response, I don't know what her response was, but it must have been, what? Within an hour, the news was out. Douglass had married Helen Pitts. Rosetta never warmed up to Helen, let's just put it that way. But that marriage to Helen, the last 11 years of Mr. D's life, by all accounts, was a terrific marriage. She became a rather public wife. She was very well educated, Mount graduate, came from an abolitionist family, had real abolitionist chops. She'd worked in a slave refugee camp here in D.C. during the war, caught malaria, had read a lot of literature, even more than Douglass had, and they did an 11-month tour of Europe and the Mediterranean together. He had a companion very different from Anna in his second marriage, but it was by any measure the most scandalous marriage of the 19th century. The most famous black man in the world has married a white woman 20 years younger. And last thought, the crazies and the press went nuts over this for months on end. One entire scrapbook in the Evans collection, one of the 9 scrapbooks, is totally devoted to newspaper clippings about the marriage to Helen. It just goes on and on and on for months. One of the craziest things that happened is that the articles kept making him older and her younger. He was in his 70s, she was 31. It's just, anyway.
We'll go ahead and be able to take some questions from the floor in that. Okay. I saw, yes.
So we've already talked all about the private life. We don't have to go there, do we? Go ahead.
Stand up.
I'm a doctor. Thank you for coming. I'm sure I see you have everyone. So I was reading the book. I only actually thought about this whole idea of profit, right? And history reported profitates and what that really means, you know?
Uh-huh.
And so I guess that as a background, my question is, I feel like the way that you wrote, the way he was introduced to certain words,
Yeah.
and your book was as if he was introduced to new friends and new colleagues and new supporters with each new word that he discovered.
Oh.
Liberated him more and provided a scaffolding to him being a prophet of freedom, just as much as in his social life and certain people. I felt that these words also became his very intimate partners as well towards his life. So with that, could you just speak to, if you will, his relationship and courtships with these words that propelled him forward as we know him today?
Okay, wow. His courtship with words. I wish I had used that as a word. He was courting words.
That's my interpretation, I should say.
Well, I like it,
so.
actually. Words were magic to Douglass. It starts, as I said, very young, very early. And when you're doing biography, there are always things you just can't quite know about your subject. You just can't get there. You can't quite say that. You don't quite know. But here's one thing I do know. This guy was a sponge. He has no formal education, not a day in his life in a school. His education was not only books. Rest assured, he's an incredible reader. And his book collection, by the way, is out in Landover in the National Park Service's warehouse. I've been in his book collection. It's incredible. But he didn't underline and scratch in the margins. But he was a sponge in the sense that if he met you, he'd try to figure out what he could learn from you. And he might even discard you when he thinks he's learned all he can from you. I don't need you anymore. What about you? He learned from people were his schools. People were his sources. And this is true of numerous abolitionists that he knew. Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Martin Delaney to a degree, black abolitionists, even Charles Lennox Ramon, although they have an awful breakup too. Can't quite say that about Lincoln. It wasn't an intimate relationship he had with Lincoln. So, but words become, you can't chart his, I wish I could, chart the growth of his vocabulary. Wouldn't that be cool? I could have had a graph in the back. But he mastered the simplicity of words. I will say he overused adjectives. I mean, oh my God, sometimes a sentence will have 6 adjectives. And that's kind of 19th century rhetoric and oratory too. A slaveholder was not just a terrible slaveholder. He was a man-stealing, child-whipping, woman-destroying, earth-shattering, and slaveholder. Emphasis, emphasis, emphasis. He learned the fine art in oratory of the use of the refrain. Right? The refrain. A little phrase that you're going to use 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the speech. You're drawing your audience back. And he became a genius at the use of the pause. Seriously. You know who's good at pausing? Adam Schiff.
Yeah.
Pretty pause. I mean, whatever you think of the arguments, I don't know. But, man. So, and he could find metaphors in his head that, and sometimes they're biblical, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're from nature. Lots of metaphors from nature that don't take fancy language. But if you've ever read the narrative or the second autobiography, Bondage and Freedom, I still think the most beautiful moment of prose in anti-slavery literature is when Douglass is remembering being about a 17-year-old teenage slave on Edward Covey's farm. Covey is the kind of slave breaker type overseer. He's hired out to, beats the Dickens out of him week after week after week, but he gets Sundays off, and he would sit out on the ridge looking out at the Chesapeake, and he remembered in the narrative that he would sit under a tree in total despair and look out on the Chesapeake and see the hundreds of white sailing ships. And he converted the white sailing ships into swift-winged angels that fly around the world. And oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks and could fly with you, as though he's speaking to the ships. That's not fancy language, but it's gorgeous in its pain. That's a prophet who can find the language to describe and make us feel something that we can't quite feel on our own. Or sometimes he would just employ an Old Testament story, like Noah's Ark. You might wonder why. Oh, God, could he use Noah's Ark? Well, we don't probably have time, I could illustrate that, but let's go take another question. Oh, anyway.
Probably just one more, right?
Oh, no.
Because I was just, yeah, no, yeah, it's okay. You were ready. I kept answering. You were ready.
Good to see you again, Doc.
Nice to see you.
Yes, sir.
I saw you last at the Black Soldier meeting.
Yes, sir. The prophetic issue, Douglass, after reading a lot of these manuscripts, the lost cause.
Mm-hmm.
He starts mentioning this very early, earlier than I could see anywhere else. The abolitions were all kind of happy. You expound on him being prophetic in that?
Oh, Lord, well, yeah. Well, the lost cause in its imagery was probably begun at Appomattox. Douglass is attacking the lost cause ideology in the 1860s. I don't know if you remember his quote when Robert E. Lee dies in 1870. It's only 5 years after the war. And he says he is sick and tired of hearing the, quote, nauseating flatteries of Robert E. Lee. Why does the man who fights in the worst losing cause get the most eulogies, and so on and so on? You can already see that him there developing his critique of this story of the noble soldier who fought for home and his people and his land, as even, you know, the New York papers are honoring Lee and his death. Then, as time went on, he developed a thoroughgoing criticism is a mild word for the lost cause tradition. He essentially considered it a lie, a misuse of history, the constant claim that the South never fought for slavery, that the war wasn't really about slavery, that emancipation and the remaking of the Constitution weren't really its results. He saw the lost cause as a kind of an ideological basis for the emerging world of Jim Crow. And he delivers that critique for 25 years. All over the place. At soldiers' reunions, at Black emancipation reunions, all kinds of events. I don't know. I saw you and you and over here in the second row. Shout it out.
Yeah, one question about going to the media with the book. With our world technology today, why put the story back into a book? With our world today, it could be easily brought to light in digital platform. Okay, I understand. Why go back to a book versus having it more technically? You know, question.
Okay, short answer. Some of us love books. I didn't mean to denigrate that question at all. I'll just say this. My publisher at my editor at Simon & Schuster tells me that, and they're one of the biggest presses, of all their sales in nonfiction, it's still about 75% hard copy. In fiction, it's about 50-50. But audiobooks are doing very well because of the way people live, because of the way we live today. Commuting, running on treadmills. I got an email from a guy, an American in Japan, I don't know why that matters, was telling me he was listening to the book while swimming. They're underwater, so that's your argument. Just put it all on underwater devices? I don't know. Well, how about a movie? We're going to try to make a movie.
This gentleman is going to be portraying you in a theater.
Not me.
Not you.
No. I don't do it.
Isn't it true, Mr. Douglass said in terms of his relationship with his black wife and his white wife, he made a quote that said that I married my first wife in honor of my mother, whom I only knew for a short while. But I married my second wife in honor to the father that I never met.
He did say that. Precisely what he meant at any given time, and he used that more than once. He sometimes would use that for humor, because he knows he's dealing with, look, you don't need me to tell you, the crazy racist attitudes out there about a black man marrying a white woman. He needed a little humor sometimes. Although he might have actually meant it too. He had a very ambivalent view of, his surviving owner. He had two owners, Aaron Anthony and Thomas Auld. Thomas Auld lived till 1879, 1880. And Douglass famously went to his deathbed, or near deathbed, to see him, to literally ask him, "Are you my father?" And all did not say yes. That still doesn't prove it, but it's possible he meant it in some way. He was always deeply curious, more than curious, he was always trying to figure out who is my father. And he would do it in part through the children of Thomas Old. He actually became fairly good friends with Ald's two surviving children, Amanda and Benjamin Auld. They never told him that, yes, our father is your father too. They may not have known it. So yes, there's ambivalence in there. There may be some humor at times. There may be some real difficult feelings at times. And also at the base of that, deep down, is of course Douglass's knowledge that whoever the father was, it means his mother was probably right.
I know with the timing.
Tell us how Frederick Douglass knew the founder of American University.
Well, let me say this, because we do have to get him to the table to sign. We appreciate your vocalness at this moment, but we do have to get Dr. Blight back and to keep on schedule. One of the joys about doing these, and especially this publication, is that many of us realize that we could go on all night, probably into the morning. I had mentioned to him the struggle I was really
You'd have to have an
was
open bar.
cut it off. Well, there are many who would be volunteering to take care of that for you, but in the midst of this, we say thank you to Dr. Blight for being here this evening. And being with us. Certainly on behalf of our dean, our bishop, my colleagues, the Racial Justice Task Force, we certainly have appreciated this coordination. And of course, Sam, we thank you for helping to make this possible in the relationships that we have here on the close, working together, being able to do those things that really help us to be stronger in so many different ways. And we thank each and every one of you for coming tonight. And we look forward to taking this moment as well as future moments. We encourage you to come back to the cathedral, where we are seeking, of course, to bring individuals together, the convening space that we have, so that we can have meaningful discussions and build the kind of community that we all know we need in days like today. Thank you very much.